yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Let's get started. It was a rare moment of peace, and I relished it. Poirot and I had found ourselves ensconced in the sunlit parlour of the King's Rest Inn, the finest establishment in Little Wimbury, which, given the village's size, was not a particularly competitive accolade. We had spent the morning walking the lanes, admiring tidy thatched cottages and the village green, before settling at a table near the window, overlooking the square. The occasion was not professional, but rather one of those rural interludes Poirot found inexplicably appealing, though, truth be told, his fondness for village life lasted only until the pastry basket was empty. On this occasion, the scones were particularly fine, and I was halfway through praising them when the conversation at a neighbouring table caught my ear. "Such a grand affair," a woman in a feathered hat was saying. "Evelyn Harrowgate's wedding, tomorrow at St. Winifred's. Everyone who's anyone will be there." "Scandal, if you ask me," her companion sniffed. "After what happened to her sister." I leaned toward Poirot, who was buttering his third scone with meticulous precision. "Bit of local gossip," I remarked. "The sort of thing you love." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Mon ami," he said grandly, "there is no gossip so small that it does not contain some grain of human truth. Continue to eavesdrop, I beg." Despite my protests at being made a common spy, I listened as snippets drifted across. A wealthy bride, a reluctant groom, and, though the speaker lowered her voice too much for me to hear clearly, some unfortunate incident in the family's past. I had just opened my mouth to repeat the more colourful details when the waitress approached, bearing a letter. "For Monsieur Poirot," she said. The envelope was crumpled, as though passed through several hands before reaching us, and the ink had run slightly, as if exposed to damp. The address was written in an unsteady hand. Hercule Poirot, the King's Rest Inn, Little Wimbury. There was no sender's name. Poirot's eyebrows lifted in mild surprise. "A fan letter, perhaps," he suggested, sliding a knife delicately under the flap. "The fame of Poirot, it travels far, does it not?" I leaned forward eagerly as he unfolded the single sheet within. The message was brief and startling. "A murder will be committed at St. Winifred's Church at precisely 12:15 on the wedding day. No one will believe the killer, for she will be the bride herself." I stared. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "That's ghastly and ridiculous. Someone's idea of a joke." Poirot's expression sharpened. "Joke, you say? And yet observe, the paper is expensive, the hand unskilled but determined. A person unused to writing, yet they wish to impress urgency. The ink blot here. See how the pen pressed down, as if the hand trembled." "It's still absurd," I said. "The bride of all people. No one would murder at the altar." "Would they not?" Poirot's eyes glittered. "What better place, mon ami, where all eyes see only love and joy? A perfect crime, concealed in ceremony." I found this reasoning needlessly dramatic. "If you ask me," I said, "it's some local mischief maker trying to frighten the poor girl." Poirot only smiled faintly and tucked the letter into his pocket. "There is always a story behind such mischief, mon ami," he said. "Let us not dismiss the thing so quickly." At that moment, the door swung open, and a postman entered with a parcel. Normal village life continued, but in Poirot's mind, the first act of the drama had already begun. "Be serious, Poirot," I said, once the waitress had cleared our tea things. "You don't really intend to involve yourself in this farce?" Poirot regarded me with something dangerously close to pity. "My dear Hastings, you have the English love of dismissing all things improbable until they become unavoidable. The letter is not so far-fetched as you think." I scoffed. "A bride committing murder at her own wedding? It's pure theatre." "Exactement." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And you forget, mon ami, that human beings adore the theatre. They model their crimes upon it. I shook my head, bemused. I grant you the letter is curious, but really, Poirot, this isn't one of your grand London cases. We're in a village where the greatest scandal is Mrs. Pettigrew's overripe tomatoes. Poirot's moustache bristled at this insult to his instincts. I observe, Hastings, that you are already convinced of the innocence of the bride. I, however, prefer to keep an open mind. She hasn't even committed a crime yet. All the more reason to attend, Poirot said, as if that settled the matter. Prevention, mon cher, is the finest form of detection. Seeing I could not sway him, I made one final attempt at logic. If the letter writer truly feared a murder, why not go directly to the police? Poirot tapped his temple. Ah, because, Hastings, there is shame or danger attached to their knowledge, a secret they dare not reveal directly, yet one too heavy to carry alone. His reasoning was maddeningly circular. So you plan to go to the wedding tomorrow? Just on the strength of this? Poirot rose, adjusting his cuffs with meticulous care. Mais oui, and you, mon ami, shall accompany me, in your finest morning coat. I suppose, I said heavily, there's no talking you out of this. None whatsoever. Poirot's smile was triumphant. Besides, a wedding is a charming affair. One never knows what secrets may walk down the aisle. Poirot held the letter delicately between his fingertips, as if it were some fragile artifact in a museum, and studied it with the care one might devote to a priceless relic. His head tilted slightly to the left, his moustache twitching with every thought that passed through his agile mind. Well, I said, stirring my tea, what do you make of it? A curious performance, Poirot murmured. Consider, mon ami, the psychology of the thing. To write such a letter, to warn, but not to sign, this speaks of guilt, yes, or perhaps fear. Or a childish prank, I offered, not wishing to be dragged into another of Poirot's labyrinthine theories. These village weddings always have some romantic nonsense attached to them. Curses, omens, family feuds. Ah, but see here, Poirot tapped the paper. The hour, precisely noted, 12:15. Such precision. This is not the work of a romantic. No, it is the hand of someone who has rehearsed this moment, over and over, until only the final act remains. I found this wildly overdramatic. If you ask me, I said, the whole thing smacks of someone trying to frighten the bride into calling off the wedding. Perhaps. Poirot's eyes gleamed. But if so, why direct the letter to Hercule Poirot? Why involve the great detective if the aim is merely to scare? I had no ready answer to this, and Poirot, seeing my confusion, smiled with maddening satisfaction. You see, Hastings, he said gently, already the story grows richer. Who would want a famous detective present at a wedding, unless they desired the crime to be seen? Unless they needed an audience? I could not help but shiver slightly at the thought. In Poirot's mind, the drama had already begun. The following morning, Poirot stood before the mirror in our modest room at the inn, arranging his tie with his usual meticulous care. He had chosen his grey morning suit, with a pale lavender cravat, far too formal, I thought, for a village wedding where half the guests would be in borrowed hats. Are you certain about this, Poirot? I asked, still unconvinced we had any real reason to attend. We could spend the day quite peacefully, a walk by the river perhaps, or a game of billiards. Non, non, non! Poirot spun around, stabbing a finger dramatically in my direction. A letter has been written, a challenge issued. To ignore it would be an insult to my little grey cells. But what if nothing happens? I asked. What if the wedding goes off without a hitch? Poirot's eyes twinkled. Then we shall enjoy cake, mon ami. But I do not think it will be so simple. Already the hand of destiny stirs. I sighed, resigned. There was no arguing with him once his mind was made up. Thus, it was decided. We would attend the Harrogate wedding, whether or not murder chose to keep its appointment. The morning dawned bright and clear, the sort of day one might call perfect for a village wedding. I must confess, my spirits had improved considerably once I saw that the church stood at the heart of the square, its ancient stone walls half covered in climbing roses. It was exactly the sort of charming rural setting I always imagined in such scenes, and for a moment I dared to hope the entire affair would pass without incident. Poirot, on the other hand, was in full peacock mode, as I called it privately. His grey morning suit was pressed to perfection, his patent leather shoes shone like mirrors, and the pocket square in his lapel, lavender, of course, had been folded with mathematical precision. Villagers stared at him as if he were a visiting dignitary, but Poirot, oblivious, strutted up the church path like a general inspecting his troops. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured. "How they smile, how they exchange the whispers. Such happiness, yes, but also such envy, such petty rivalry. Beneath every village wedding lies a small battlefield." I was about to object to this needlessly cynical view when a stout woman in a feathered hat stopped to stare at Poirot. "Are you—" "Oh, you are. You're that detective. My sister's brother-in-law read about you in the Telegraph." Poirot bowed deeply. "Hercule Poirot, at your service." I could see the story would circulate through the pews before the bride even arrived. The guests filled the little church in cheerful disarray, old friends greeting each other, younger guests exchanging shy glances. Poirot and I took seats near the back, giving him an excellent view of the entire congregation, something I should have recognized as deliberate. "Now, mon ami," he whispered, "the play begins." I shook my head, amused despite myself. Only Poirot could transform a peaceful country wedding into a stage set for drama. The organ swelled, and all conversation hushed as the first notes of the wedding march echoed through the church. Every head turned toward the door, where Evelyn Harrogate stood on her father's arm. She was beautiful in the traditional sense, pale, serious, and slender, her veil trailing like mist behind her. I noticed Poirot's keen eyes studying every step she took. "Too pale," he murmured. "Too serious." "She's a bride," I whispered back. "They always look like that." "Non," said Poirot. "They do not." The ceremony began smoothly enough. The vicar, an elderly man with a sombre manner, spoke the familiar words of blessing, and the couple faced each other, hands trembling slightly. It was at that moment, the exact moment Evelyn placed her hand in Charles Denbury's, that the horror occurred. Charles's face twisted sharply. His knees buckled, and with a strangled noise he collapsed onto the stone floor. The silence shattered into chaos. Women shrieked. Guests surged forward. Evelyn stood frozen, her gloved hand still outstretched where her fiancé had been standing. The vicar, white-faced, muttered a prayer under his breath. For my part, I confess, I was struck completely dumb. I had never seen a man drop dead at the altar. Poirot, of course, was entirely composed. While others flailed about uselessly, he glided forward, kneeling beside the body. "His lips, you see, Hastings," he murmured, already darkening. "Cyanide, most assuredly." "Cyanide?" I echoed stupidly. "But who—" Poirot did not answer. His gaze was already drifting toward the bride, who swayed slightly on her feet before collapsing into a dead faint, her bouquet scattering roses and ribbons across the aisle. The guests, panicked, began murmuring darkly. "She touched him," someone said. "He died the moment they touched hands." Others whispered about the family curse, about secrets buried in the Harrogate past. Poirot took a delicate step back, surveying the chaos like a painter admiring a canvas. "Ah," he said softly, "the perfect crime, in full view of every eye. The artistry, Hastings, it is exquisite." "Artistry? It's horrible," I protested. "We need to fetch a doctor, the police." "Later," said Poirot. "First, we observe." Even as the bride was carried out, pale and limp, Poirot's gaze flickered across the congregation, reading every face, noting every reaction. Somewhere among these people was a murderer, and already Poirot had begun his silent hunt. For a moment there was silence, the kind of stunned, breathless silence that follows an unthinkable event. All eyes turned to the bride, who stood trembling, her face as pale as her veil. She stared down at Charles Denbury's crumpled form, her fingers still outstretched as though reaching for a man who was no longer there. Then came the scream, high-pitched, raw, and utterly unrestrained. Evelyn staggered backward, clutching at her veil as if it might shield her from the terrible sight before her. The scream dissolved into hysterical sobbing, and with a strangled cry she collapsed onto the cold stone floor. Several women rushed forward, fanning her uselessly, while a maid dabbed at her brow with a scented handkerchief. The vicar, still pale himself, offered a murmured prayer. Someone shouted for a doctor. The congregation, once a sea of polite smiles and floral hats, was now a collection of gaping mouths and whispered speculations. I will admit, my own thoughts ran in a rather predictable line. "Poirot," I whispered urgently. "It's obvious, isn't it? The bride. She poisoned him herself. That letter was a warning about her all along." Poirot's expression was maddeningly not one of alarm, but of mild amusement. "Ah, Hastings," he said softly. "You leap to conclusions with such enthusiasm. It is almost admirable. But she touched him. The moment they joined hands, he collapsed. It's clear as day." "Is it?" Poirot's gaze swept the scene. "Or does it only seem so because you expect it to?" There was no time for argument, for at that moment, Lady Harriet Harrowgate, the bride's formidable mother, barged her way through the throng. Her face was a mask of rage and fear, a combination I found unsettling. "Get her out of here," Lady Harriet barked. "This wedding is over." Evelyn was carried from the church, limp and ghost-like. All the while, Poirot stood perfectly still, his head slightly cocked, as though listening to some sound only he could hear. As the guests milled about uselessly, Poirot descended upon the altar with the quiet confidence of a man taking his rightful place on stage. Where others saw chaos, he saw clues, the fragments of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. He knelt gracefully beside the body, and I, though shaken, followed his lead. The groom lay in a graceless sprawl, his right hand still curled slightly inward. Poirot's fingers hovered briefly over Charles's wrist before withdrawing. "Cyanide," he murmured. "I was correct. Do you notice the odour, mon ami? Bitter almonds." I sniffed cautiously and nodded. But how was it administered? There's no glass. Nothing he could have drunk. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A clever question, Hastings, and one which tells me you are at least awake this morning." Ignoring me, he turned his attention to the bride's bouquet, which lay abandoned where it had fallen. His fingers skimmed the petals with unusual care, pausing to inspect the ribbon binding the stems. With a soft "ah" of satisfaction, he plucked something tiny and glinting from the folds of the lace, a minute glass phial, shattered at the neck. "Poison in the bouquet?" I asked, horrified. "That's diabolical." "Non," said Poirot. "It is too obvious, too theatrical. This, I suspect, is a gift left for us after the fact, a piece of deliberate misdirection." He set the bouquet aside and turned back to the groom's body, eyes narrowing as they fixed on Charles's right hand, the very hand that had clasped Evelyn's. Poirot unfolded the fingers delicately, revealing a small red mark at the base of the thumb. "A prick," Poirot said softly, "like from a needle." "But why?" Poirot's finger rose, silencing me. "Hush, Hastings. It is the small things that matter." He stood abruptly, his gaze sweeping the pews, finally landing on the very spot where Evelyn had stood. Without a word, Poirot crossed the aisle and crouched beside the carved wooden bench, running his fingers along the surface. There, nearly invisible, was a tiny indentation, as though something sharp and slender had been briefly lodged there. Poirot smiled. "The perfect crime, my friend, does not rely on brute force. It relies on psychology and timing." "What do you mean?" Poirot simply tapped his temple. Wait and see. With the church emptied and the bride carried off to the Harrogate estate in a state of near collapse, Poirot took command in his own unmistakable style. The local constable, clearly overawed by Poirot's reputation, ceded control without argument. "We begin, mon ami," Poirot said, hands clasped neatly behind his back, "by assembling the cast." "Cast?" I repeated. "You make it sound like a play." "But is it not?" Poirot's gaze swept the now empty pews. "A wedding is a performance, and each guest a player, and among them, the author of a most cunning murder." With that, Poirot dictated a list to the constable, naming each person of interest with the precision of a man building a house of cards. First, Lady Harriet Harrogate, the bride's formidable mother. "A woman," Poirot noted, "for whom reputation is more precious than jewels." Next came Hugh Denbury, the groom's younger brother, who now stood to inherit the entire family fortune. "A fortune," Poirot added, "which might, to some, outweigh brotherly love." The third name was Vicar Ambrose Clennet, who performed the ceremony and had known both families for decades. A man with too much knowledge, perhaps, and too much conscience. Finally, Miss Ruby Leighton, the bride's childhood friend, whose trembling hands and swollen eyes had not escaped Poirot's notice. Where there is love unreturned, there is always the seed of bitterness. As Poirot handed the list to the constable, I could not help but feel a chill of excitement. Here, assembled like pieces on a chessboard, were the characters in our latest mystery. And at their centre, Poirot himself, the master player. It was barely an hour later when Lady Harriet Harrogate swept into the drawing-room of her family estate like a warship under full sail. Even in mourning, her presence dominated the room, from her towering hat to the gloved hand that clutched a lace handkerchief with unnecessary force. "I demand to know why my daughter is being treated like a criminal," she declared, before anyone had even spoken. "This is outrageous. Evelyn is delicate. Far too delicate for such treatment." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madame, you mistake us. No accusation has been made. But there has been a death, yes? And until we understand its cause, we must ask certain uncomfortable questions." Lady Harriet's nostrils flared, but she sat, arranging her skirts with fierce precision. "Ask then. But be quick about it." Poirot's voice was mild. "You approved of this marriage, madam?" There was the slightest hesitation. Charles Denbury was suitable. Despite his first wife? The handkerchief twisted sharply in her fingers. That was an unfortunate incident, and I saw to it that it would not trouble Evelyn. "Ah," said Poirot, eyes half closed. "You saw to it, and yet it troubles you still." "Rubbish," Lady Harriet snapped. "Evelyn knew nothing of it, and if you suggest otherwise, monsieur, I shall have you thrown out." Poirot's smile was blandly courteous. "Of course, madame." But as Lady Harriet swept out, her footsteps sharp on the parquet floor, I caught the unmistakable gleam of satisfaction in Poirot's eye. "Poirot," I said, "you provoked her deliberately." "Naturellement," he said. "A mother's love, mon ami. It is a most dangerous force, and Lady Harriet loves not only her daughter, but also her name." I began to protest, but Poirot was already preparing to meet the next suspect, his mind racing ahead while mine struggled to keep up. If Lady Harriet had entered like a battleship, Hugh Denbury drifted in with all the presence of a man reluctantly summoned to a chore. He was tall, angular, and gave the distinct impression of someone accustomed to moving through life without attracting undue attention, a stark contrast to his late brother's more polished charm. Hugh took a chair with slouched indifference, one elbow resting on the armrest as though even sitting upright required more energy than he cared to expend. I could not help but dislike him instantly, not for any concrete reason, but for the casual way he seemed to shrug off the death of his own brother. Poirot, however, treated him with courteous neutrality, offering tea, which Hugh declined with a muttered, "No need." I imagine this has all been quite a shock, Poirot began. Not really, said Hugh. Charles always had a knack for attracting trouble. I raised an eyebrow. That's a cold way to speak about your brother. Hugh's thin smile did nothing to warm my opinion of him. Charles knew what he was getting into. That whole Harrogate family, trouble from the start. Yet you attended the wedding, Poirot noted. Had to, Hugh said flatly. Family duty and all that. Poirot's gaze rested briefly on Hugh's hands, which were calloused but immaculately clean, before gliding back to his face. And now, monsieur, with your brother gone, you inherit everything. Hugh gave a careless shrug. That's what the lawyers tell me. I half expected Poirot to press him further, but my little friend merely inclined his head and thanked him for his time. As Hugh slouched out, Poirot murmured, Mon ami, there is nothing so dangerous as a man who expects fortune to fall into his lap. The vicar arrived next, his tall frame slightly stooped, as if burdened by more than age. He had the mournful air of a man who carried too many secrets, and his fingers twitched nervously at his cassock as he took his seat. Poirot greeted him with respectful formality, but the vicar seemed ill at ease. Such a tragedy, he murmured, eyes downcast. A wedding should be a moment of joy, and yet… Poirot folded his hands. You have known both families for many years, I believe? Since they were children, the vicar confirmed, and some of the past difficulties should, perhaps, have been heeded more closely. What difficulties, monsieur? Poirot's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. The vicar hesitated, before saying softly, the Denburys and the Harrogates, their union was never wise. He would say no more, though Poirot's gentle prodding continued for several minutes. At last, with a cryptic blessing, the vicar excused himself, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. Poirot steepled his fingers. A man of faith, he said softly, but not, I think, a man at peace. If the vicar carried secrets like stones in his pockets, Miss Ruby Layton wore hers openly across her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands trembled so violently that her teacup rattled against the saucer. She was a slight young woman, with the air of someone perpetually on the edge of tears or flight. Yet when she spoke, her voice was surprisingly sharp. This never should have happened, she said, twisting a handkerchief until it was a limp knot. Evelyn and Charles. It was all too fast, too unnatural. You disapproved of the marriage. Poirot's voice was gentle, but his gaze was unrelenting. Ruby's mouth trembled. She didn't even love him. Not really. They barely knew each other. It wasn't right. Yet you were Evelyn's dearest friend, Poirot observed. Surely you would wish for her happiness. Ruby gave a bitter laugh, one that ended in a small sob. That's just it. I wanted her to be happy, but not with him. I glanced at Poirot, startled by the vehemence in her voice. But my friend only offered her a courteous bow as the interview ended. As she left, Poirot's expression softened, but his eyes were still alight with speculation. Ah, mon ami, he murmured. The heart. It is the most dangerous weapon of all. Poirot and I remained at the Harrogate estate long after the initial chaos had subsided. The guests were either dispersed in hushed clusters, whispering wild theories, or had retreated altogether. The bride lay in her room under heavy sedation, while Lady Harriet patrolled the corridors like a general inspecting the front line. It was during one of these lulls that a maid, white-faced and wringing her hands, approached Poirot. "Please, sir, I found this," she stammered, holding out a small glass phial, the neck broken cleanly off. Poirot accepted the phial delicately, holding it up to the light. "Empty," he observed, "but the scent, it lingers. Cyanide." I whistled. "That settles it then. The poison was in the bouquet. When Evelyn held it near Charles, he must have inhaled the vapour." Poirot's expression was one of exaggerated pity. "Ah, Hastings, so quick, so eager. and so utterly wrong. I had no time to argue before Lady Harriet stormed in, brandishing a lace glove. "This," she declared, "was found near the altar. It is Evelyn's. And look." The fingertips bore faint yellow stains. Poirot examined the glove, nodding thoughtfully. "Curious, but it tells me nothing." "Nothing?" I cried. "It's proof Evelyn handled poison." "Non," said Poirot. "It is proof someone wants us to believe she did." He placed the glove aside. "A performance, mon ami, but who is our playwright?" It was the vicar's wife, a sharp-eyed woman with a fondness for gossip, who eagerly supplied the next piece of the puzzle. "Oh yes," she said. "There was a terrible row between them the night before the wedding. I heard it myself as I was passing by the rectory garden. Raised voices, her saying something about never forgiving him, and him shouting back about secrets staying buried." This naturally fanned the flames of my already burning suspicions. "There you have it, Poirot. Proof Evelyn had a motive." Poirot only smiled faintly. "Proof, mon ami, that people hear what they wish to hear." "But if they argued—" "Arguments before weddings," Poirot said serenely, "are more common than wedding cake. They reveal passion, not always murder." Nonetheless, Poirot noted every detail the vicar's wife could provide, from the exact time she overheard the quarrel to the tone in Evelyn's voice, which, according to the woman, wavered between fury and fear. As we left, Poirot murmured, "Fear, Hastings, it is a most instructive emotion. If one knows what the bride feared, one would know much indeed." Later that afternoon, while most of the household remained in disarray, Poirot insisted on returning to the church. "The stage, mon ami," he said, "always reveals something the actors forget." He moved to the pew where Evelyn had stood, running his fingers along the smooth oak until they stopped abruptly at a shallow indentation, nearly invisible. "Here," Poirot said softly. "Once rested something very small, very deliberate." "What was it?" I asked. Poirot smiled enigmatically. "A clue, Hastings. One placed not for the police, but for me." Before I could press him, Poirot turned briskly on his heel, leaving me to follow, still entirely in the dark. It was precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Poirot's command was issued, and by past, the drawing-room of Harrogate Estate had been transformed into a theatre of suspicion. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back to allow the grey light of the fading day to cast long shadows across the polished floor. A crackling fire did little to warm the atmosphere, for the true heat in the room came from the unsaid tensions hanging between the gathered suspects. Lady Harriet sat bolt upright, her gloved hands clenched in her lap like talons. Opposite her, Hugh Denbury, slouched with deliberate insolence, one ankle resting across his knee. Near the window stood Vicar Clenette, wringing his hands in nervous agitation, while poor Miss Ruby Layton hovered by the mantelpiece, her eyes still red from crying. Poirot entered last, moving with ceremonial slowness, his hands folded neatly before him, his expression unreadable. I, naturally, trailed behind, feeling awkwardly out of place, like a man caught in the wrong play. As the door clicked shut, all eyes turned to Poirot. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot said softly, "thank you for your gracious attendance. It is time for the little grey cells to begin their delicate work." I noticed, with no small curiosity, that even Lady Harriet's imperious demeanour flickered slightly under Poirot's gaze. Whatever game was afoot, the first move had been made. "Let me say this at once, Monsieur Poirot," Lady Harriet began, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Whatever scandal you are imagining, you will leave my daughter out of it." Poirot inclined his head politely. "I assure you, madame, I imagine nothing. I merely observe." She sniffed. "Then observe this. Evelyn adored Charles. She would no more harm him than she would her own reflection." Poirot stepped forward, his fingertips pressed together. "And yet, Lady Harriet, you yourself expressed certain reservations about this marriage." Did you not? Her jaw tightened. I had my reasons. Reasons which included, perhaps, the unfortunate matter of the first Mrs. Denbury? The colour rose sharply in her cheeks, though her voice remained icy. That was a youthful mistake, one that was handled privately as it should have been. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. Handled? That is a curious word, madame. I could see Lady Harriet's composure begin to crack. What are you implying? Only that secrets, madame, rarely remain buried, especially when they are dug up on the eve of a wedding. Her fingers tightened around the pearls at her neck. You have no proof Evelyn knew any of it. Non, said Poirot smoothly. But you did, and you, madame, have made it abundantly clear that nothing at all, is more important to you than the Harrowgate name. Lady Harriet's eyes flashed with anger. Protecting one's family is hardly a crime. Ah, said Poirot softly, but in the desire to protect, sometimes one sees only what one wishes to see. It was a curious response, and one which left Lady Harriet speechless for once. As she drew herself up to her full height, Poirot only bowed slightly, allowing the silence to settle like dust upon old furniture. If Lady Harriet had been all indignant fury, Hugh Denbury was the very picture of languid indifference. He lounged in his chair with a careless sprawl, one hand flicking an invisible speck from his trousers. Well, he drawled. Let's have it then. What's the great detective's theory? That I stabbed my own brother between hymns? Hastings, already bristling at the man's insolence, spoke before Poirot could answer. Your brother was murdered. Don't you care at all? Hugh's smile was thin. Care? Oh, I cared once. But Charles had a habit of getting himself into messy situations and expecting others to clean them up. And now you inherit everything, I snapped. Spare me the melodrama, Hugh said lazily. The family money was always going to come my way eventually. Charles was bound to self-destruct one way or another. There was something deeply unpleasant about the way he said it. Not grief, nor even relief, but the tone of a man who had stopped expecting anything from life except other people's misfortunes. Poirot studied him with the air of a man examining a poorly made painting. Monsieur Denbury, I wonder, where were you immediately before the ceremony? Hugh shrugged. I popped into the vestry, needed a moment's peace. To pray? I asked sarcastically. Hugh's grin widened. Hardly. To smoke? Poirot's head tilted slightly, his expression almost sympathetic. And you saw nothing unusual? Only a parson sweating through his collar, Hugh said. But then, vicars are always twitchy. Poirot said nothing further. Instead, he simply offered one of those polite, unreadable smiles, the kind that made my skin crawl, and dismissed Hugh with a gesture. As the younger Denbury slouched out of the room, Poirot spoke so quietly, I almost missed it. You see, Hastings, the grief that is too little is sometimes more revealing than the grief that is too much. Miss Ruby Layton had the air of someone held together by sheer willpower, and very little else. When Poirot summoned her to the drawing-room, she entered clutching her handkerchief as though it were a life raft. Her eyes, still red from crying, darted around the room before finally settling on Poirot. And even then, only briefly, as if meeting his gaze might cause her to crumble entirely. I should never have introduced them, she said, her voice trembling. It's all my fault. Poirot's head tilted gently. Introduced whom, mademoiselle? Evelyn and Charles. A fresh tear rolled down her cheek. They met at my birthday party last year. I thought it would be romantic, you see. Childhood friends reunited, all that. But it wasn't romantic at all. Ah, Poirot murmured. And yet, they became engaged. Ruby gave a watery laugh. Oh, they got engaged all right. After a whirlwind courtship that no one understood. It was all too fast, too forced. And Evelyn, she was never quite herself with him. I was about to offer some comforting platitude, but Poirot raised a finger, eyes narrowing. Mademoiselle, You blame yourself for this union. Pourquoi? Because, Ruby whispered, her voice breaking. I was the one who loved him first. She dissolved into uncontrollable sobs, leaving me to exchange a helpless glance with Poirot. But Poirot merely nodded, as though some unseen piece of the puzzle had slipped into place. Unrequited love, he said softly, after she left. It is the oldest story of all, mon ami, and sometimes the most dangerous. Vicar Ambrose Clenet was a man of pale complexion and watery eyes, and he seemed even paler than usual when he took his seat before Poirot. His fingers moved constantly, smoothing his cassock, twisting his wedding band. All the while his gaze drifted toward the floor, avoiding both Poirot's sharp stare and my far less intimidating one. Poirot opened gently. Monsieur le Vicaire, you have known both families for many years, n'est-ce pas? The vicar gave a jerky nod. Since before Evelyn was born. I christened her, in fact. Then you must have observed the courtship, yes? A shadow passed over the vicar's face. Observed, and worried. Worried, I prompted. The vicar sighed. Some unions are blessed from the start, Captain Hastings. Others, they carry the weight of old sins. Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. Old sins, monsieur. I speak in riddles, I know, the vicar said miserably. But the truth is, this marriage should never have happened. There were secrets between these families, scandals buried, not quite deep enough. I was growing impatient. But what sort of secrets? If you know something that could help, why not say so outright? The vicar's fingers twisted nervously. It is not for me to say. The dead have their right to rest after all. Poirot's voice was gentle but insistent. And the living, monsieur? Have they no right to the truth? The vicar stood abruptly, his face blotchy. All I can say is this. This tragedy did not begin yesterday. It began long ago, with a different bride and a different vow. He refused to say more, but his final words hung heavily in the room. Poirot, I noticed, was smiling faintly. Always, mon ami, he said. The past, it leaves fingerprints. That evening, Poirot conducted what I can only describe as an inventory of time itself. Armed with a small notebook and his usual unerring politeness, he revisited each suspect, reconstructing their precise movements on the morning of the wedding. First came Lady Harriet, who admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that she had personally handled Evelyn's bouquet just before the ceremony. A mother's touch, she said grandly, ensuring it was perfect. Poirot nodded. A natural gesture, madame, but also a most convenient opportunity, if one wished to add something extra. Lady Harriet's face darkened, but she said nothing. Next was Hugh Denbury, who admitted to spending the final moments before the ceremony alone in the vestry. Needed a cigarette before the whole circus started, he said with his usual flippancy. And you were alone the entire time? Poirot asked. As alone as a man can be, in a room full of religious clutter. Finally, there was Ruby Leighton, who confessed, after some prompting, that Evelyn had spoken to her in confidence the night before the wedding. According to Ruby, Evelyn had confessed cold feet, saying something about a mistake she could never undo. Poirot's pen moved swiftly, recording each alibi, each inconsistency. When we were alone again, I dared to ask, "Well, what do you make of it all?" Poirot closed his notebook with surgical precision. "Mon ami, what I make of it is this. Everyone lies." "Helpful," I said dryly. "And which lie troubles you the most?" Poirot's smile was cryptic. "Not the big ones. No, the small ones. The ones that are too convenient." He tapped his temple. "The truth, Hastings, is like the bride's veil, transparent in parts, obscured in others. But if you lift the veil at just the right angle..." He paused, eyes twinkling. "One sees all." I opened my mouth to demand a clearer explanation, but Poirot waved me off. "Patience, mon ami. Tomorrow we gather the players once more, and then, he gestured with dramatic flourish, the final act shall begin. Vicar Ambrose Clennet was not by nature a man accustomed to secrets. His face, honest to a fault, betrayed every thought before it could fully form. Yet, as Poirot pressed him for further details about the old scandals between the Denbury and Harrogate families, the poor man squirmed like a beetle under glass. Finally, with great reluctance, the vicar produced a crumpled sheet of paper from the inner pocket of his cassock. This arrived at the rectory 3 days before the wedding, he said, his voice low. No signature, no return address. Poirot unfolded the letter with the delicacy of a man handling a priceless manuscript. The message, printed in uneven block capitals, read, "If the wedding goes ahead, the past will not stay buried. Stop the marriage or the consequences will fall on your house." Très dramatique, Poirot observed. A little heavy-handed perhaps, but effective. The vicar's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. I thought it was some silly prank, until today. Curious, Poirot murmured. You did not inform the families? No. The vicar shook his head violently. They've suffered enough. And besides, what would I say? That a cowardly scribbler advised me to ruin a wedding? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Cowardly, yes, but often the cowards know more than the brave. The vicar sagged in his chair, clearly regretting every word he had uttered. Poirot folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. A wedding haunted by both the past and the present, he said softly. What could be more perfectly tragic, mon ami? That evening, Poirot gathered his notes and began comparing the accounts given by each suspect. It was a process I found excruciatingly tedious, but Poirot handled it with the enthusiasm of a child assembling a clockwork toy. Let us begin, Poirot said, with the bouquet. Lady Harriet insists she only held it to ensure the ribbon was properly tied. Yet the maid who fetched it claims Lady Harriet spent almost 10 minutes alone with the flowers. I frowned. That's hardly proof of guilt. None, but it is the first contradiction. He moved on. And Monsieur Hugh. He claims to have been alone in the vestry, but the sacristan saw him leave the vestry door ajar while speaking in a low voice to someone unseen. Who? Poirot spread his hands. That, mon ami, is the question. Then came Ruby Leighton's account. She says Evelyn confided doubts about the marriage, fears, regrets. But Lady Harriet swears Evelyn was radiant with joy on the morning of the wedding. They can't both be right. Exactament. Even the vicar's timeline wobbled uneasily under scrutiny. He claims to have arrived at the church 30 minutes before the ceremony, Poirot said, but a delivery boy swears he saw the vicar running down the lane at precisely 10 minutes past 12. That's cutting it close, I muttered. Too close, Poirot said softly. It is a tableau of small lies, mon ami, and small lies, when gathered together, form a picture most revealing. The contradictions piled higher with each account. No alibi was perfectly intact, no timeline unblemished, and yet no one story stood out as definitively false. The truth, Poirot said, tapping his temple, must live in the spaces between these accounts, the cracks where certainty gives way to fear. By the time Poirot finished his catalogue of contradictions, my patience was fraying dangerously thin. You've collected a list of half-truths and irrelevant details, I complained, pacing the room. But do you actually know who killed Charles? Poirot raised a hand. Hastings, my friend, you confuse the incomplete with the insignificant. I don't understand how you can be so calm, I protested. The case is an absolute muddle. Poirot's smile was maddeningly serene. The muddle, Hastings, is the gift. Gift? I practically shouted. A man has been murdered, his bride has collapsed, and you're treating it like a particularly good crossword puzzle. Poirot's hands fluttered, smoothing his tie. Would you prefer I weep and gnash my teeth? No, no. The detective, he must be like the surgeon, calm when others are not. Easy for you to say, I muttered. You probably solved the whole thing already. Perhaps, Poirot said lightly. That infuriating perhaps sent me storming out onto the terrace to cool my temper. When I returned, Poirot was seated precisely where I had left him, sipping from a tiny cup of tisane, his expression one of untroubled contentment. You could at least give me a hint, I grumbled. Patience, mon ami, Poirot said. The end is not far. As I stood there, debating whether to throttle him or fetch him more tea, Poirot's expression grew uncharacteristically thoughtful. Tell me, Hastings, he said suddenly, why is it that you and everyone else assume the bride must be the center of the crime? Well, the letter, I began. Ah, the letter. Poirot's finger wagged gently. A letter is merely a suggestion. It says, bride, and so you all look at the bride. Of course we do, I exclaimed. It's the logical place to look. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes glittering. And that, mon ami, is precisely why it is wrong. What? The human mind, it seeks the obvious. But crimes, true crimes, live in the unseen corners. You look at the bride, but you do not ask, who else stood at the altar? The groom, obviously, Poirot smiled. Yes, and the vicar. Exactement, but also the brother, the mother, the guests nearby. A wedding is a performance, Hastings, and performances have audiences. What are you driving at? Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. The crime, mon cher, was never about the bride. It was about someone who wore no veil at all. I stared, utterly bewildered. Who? Poirot rose with a flourish. That, Hastings, you shall learn, tomorrow, when the curtain rises on the final act. At precisely 8 o'clock that evening, the great hall of Harrogate Manor was prepared for what I had come to recognize as Poirot's favourite moment, the gathering of suspects. It was, as ever, a performance in its own right, with Poirot as both director and star. The fire had been lit, casting flickering shadows across the high ceiling. Chairs were arranged in a perfect semicircle, each precisely placed to create a sense of ceremony, as if those summoned were not so much suspects as players called to account after the curtain had fallen. Lady Harriet entered first, her posture as rigid as a portrait, her eyes sharp and suspicious. Hugh Denbury followed, his slouching insolence barely disguising a certain unease. Miss Ruby Leighton, clutching her handkerchief like a lifeline, took a seat near the fire, her gaze darting nervously between faces. Vicar Clennet hovered awkwardly near the doorway, hands folded like a man awaiting a scolding from above. Poirot stood before them, hands clasped neatly, his expression one of almost childlike anticipation, as though about to unveil a particularly clever party trick. I stood to the side, trying to look appropriately solemn, though in truth I still had only the vaguest idea of what Poirot was about to reveal. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice smooth as silk, we have gathered here not only to grieve the untimely death of Monsieur Charles Denbury, but to answer the question, who placed death at the altar? A rustle of discomfort swept through the room, but Poirot continued unperturbed. You see, my friends, murder is rarely an act of impulse. It is a story, a narrative carefully composed with each player given a role. His eyes flickered over the assembled faces. But there is only one true author of this tragedy, and before this night is through, Hercule Poirot will reveal them. There was a silence so profound I could hear the crackle of the fire and the distant tick of the mantel clock. Shall we begin? Poirot smiled. First, a symbol. With a gesture both dramatic and deliberate, Poirot crossed the room to the mantelpiece, where he had earlier placed Evelyn's bridal veil. Its delicate lace trailed over the polished wood like a ghostly shroud, the faint scent of orange blossoms still clinging to it. Behold, Poirot said, holding it aloft, the veil, the symbol of innocence and purity, but also of secrets. His fingers traced the fine embroidery, lingering briefly over a small stain I hadn't noticed before. This veil, he continued, was meant to shield the bride's face from her groom. But in truth, it shields far more, the truth itself. Hugh Denbury snorted. Is this a murder investigation or a sermon on symbolism? Poirot's smile was serene. Ah, but mon cher monsieur, you forget. Hercule Poirot does not indulge in idle symbolism. Every object, every gesture, it tells a story. He draped the veil over the back of a chair, arranging it with almost tender reverence. This wedding, he said softly, was built not upon love, but upon layers of deceit, lies old and new, secrets half buried and hastily concealed. And this veil, this delicate veil, conceals not the bride's blush, but the hand that delivered death. I felt a shiver creep along my spine. There was something about the veil's spectral presence that made the whole scene unbearably theatrical, and yet I knew Poirot's theatrics were never empty gestures. Do you mean Evelyn after all? I whispered. Poirot shook his head. Non, Hastings. The hand that killed was not the bride's. He turned back to the assembled suspects, eyes gleaming. It was the hand of someone who wore no veil at all. Poirot had always been a master of revealing hidden truths, but I could never quite prepare myself for the way he unravelled Lady Harriet. As she sat in the great hall, poised as always, her eyes flashing with indignation, Poirot's calmness was almost more disturbing than her blustering rage. "You accuse my family of this dreadful thing," Lady Harriet snapped, her voice full of venom. "You suggest that I, of all people, could be guilty of something so monstrous. How dare you, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot, entirely unruffled, leaned forward slightly, his hands folded in front of him. "Madame, I suggest nothing. I simply observe. And what I observe is a woman who would do anything to protect her family." "Protect?" she scoffed, a sharp edge to her voice. "By destroying my daughter's future." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are not a foolish woman, Lady Harriet. You knew as soon as Charles's secret came to light that the marriage was in peril. You would never allow the family's reputation to suffer. You acted, yes, but not with murder in mind." Lady Harriet stiffened, her face red with fury. "And what do you expect me to have done? To sit back and allow it all to fall apart?" Poirot smiled, his voice gentle. "You were angry, yes. You were enraged even. But your anger was born of a desire to protect your daughter, not to end her fiancé's life. It was the scandal you feared, not the death of Charles." For a moment, Lady Harriet looked as if she might rise up in outrage, but then, as if defeated, she sank back in her chair. "You're right, Monsieur Poirot. I never intended harm, but I wanted to shield Evelyn from the fallout, to protect her. It was all about protection." Poirot nodded, his expression softening. "A mother's love," he said. "It can drive one to extraordinary lengths, but never, I believe, to murder." Lady Harriet, for the first time, seemed to deflate, her anger giving way to something far more complex. Regret, perhaps, or sorrow. After Lady Harriet was excused, Poirot turned his attention to the pale figure of Vicar Ambrose Clennet, who had been nervously pacing the edges of the room, clearly distressed. He had been the source of much speculation. His cryptic warnings and the ominous letter had cast a long shadow over the investigation. Now, Poirot intended to lift that shadow. "Monsieur le Vicaire," Poirot began, his voice kind but firm. "You have been most troubled by this case, yes? I understand that you received a letter that in your mind made this crime seem much more personal." The vicar's face flushed a deep shade of red. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. The letter was a threat, but it had nothing to do with murder, I assure you." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes glinting with the light of understanding. "Tell me, monsieur, what exactly did the letter say, and what did it demand?" The vicar hesitated, but eventually he spoke. "It was a blackmail letter, not about Charles and Evelyn, not about their marriage. It was something unrelated. A past indiscretion, long buried, was being brought to light." Poirot smiled, his voice smooth. A past indiscretion. The letter was a threat to you, about something from your past, monsieur? Yes, said the vicar, sighing deeply. Some secrets, Monsieur Poirot, are not so easily put to rest. There are things we regret, things we wish had never happened. And when someone finds out, the consequences can be terrible. Poirot nodded. Ah, I see. The blackmail had nothing to do with the murder at all. The vicar's face showed relief, though it was tinged with guilt. I did not want to involve anyone else, especially not the families. I thought I could handle it on my own. Your mistake, Poirot said gently, was in thinking that you were the only one who could bear that weight. But the letter, monsieur, it was only a distraction, a red herring. The vicar's shoulders slumped. You mean it didn't matter? Non, Poirot replied. The blackmail had no bearing on Charles' death. That was something else entirely. The vicar nodded, relieved but still troubled, as Poirot's words seemed to unlock the last of his worries. Finally, Poirot turned to Ruby Layton, who had been sitting quietly, her face pale, her hands clasped in her lap. Her unrequited love for Charles Denbury had been the source of much speculation, but as Poirot questioned her, it became clear that her emotions were rooted in grief, not guilt. Miss Layton, Poirot began, his voice soft. I understand that you were quite close to Evelyn and Charles, but you also loved Charles yourself, did you not? Ruby looked up at him, her eyes filled with sadness. Yes, she whispered. I did. I always thought we'd be together, but I was never good enough for him. Poirot nodded, understanding. And when Charles became engaged to Evelyn, that must have hurt. Ruby wiped her eyes, nodding. I tried to be happy for her, I really did. But I couldn't help feeling that he had chosen her over me. Her voice trembled as she continued. I thought if I could make her understand how much she was hurting him, maybe things would be different. Poirot paused, carefully considering her words. But you did not wish to hurt Charles, did you? No, Ruby gasped, shaking her head. I never wanted to harm him. I loved him. I didn't know what to do with all that feeling. I couldn't bear the thought of losing him forever. Poirot smiled gently. Miss Layton, you may have had a motive to hurt Evelyn, but you did not have the means. Ruby looked confused. The means? The cyanide, Poirot clarified. You did not have access to it. You were not in the position to administer the poison. Ruby's face flushed with relief, though guilt still lingered in her eyes. I didn't do it, Poirot. I couldn't. Poirot nodded. I know. Your heart was broken, yes. But you were not a murderer. The means of the crime were never within your reach. Ruby let out a shaky breath. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Poirot's gaze was compassionate, but firm. Now, we turn our attention elsewhere. The real murderer is close at hand, mon ami. The moment was electric as Poirot stood before the gathering of suspects, his sharp eyes flicking between them, his presence suddenly more commanding than ever before. The time for innuendo and misdirection had passed. Now, the truth was to be revealed. Poirot glanced at Hugh Denbury, who sat slouched in his chair, as unconcerned as ever. The expression on his face, complacent, aloof, almost indifferent, was, in retrospect, the very key to his guilt. Hugh Denbury, Poirot began, his voice cutting through the tension. It is you who killed your brother. The room fell completely silent. I looked up in disbelief. The weight of Poirot's words hung heavily in the air, each syllable sinking like a stone. What? Hugh's voice was low, but the slight tremor in it betrayed a nervousness he hadn't shown before. That's ridiculous. You can't seriously think— I do, Poirot interrupted, his tone unyielding. You, Hugh, had everything to gain. Your brother, Charles, was a roadblock, an obstacle standing between you and the family fortune. Hugh shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You have no proof. Poirot's hand swept out in a grand, almost theatrical gesture. Ah, but I do, monsieur. You knew exactly how to manipulate the situation, how to plant the seeds of suspicion. From the moment Evelyn Harrogate became the target of your game, you were prepared. You knew that if your brother married her, the Denbury wealth would never be yours. You would have to wait for Charles to die, without a wife. The words landed like a thunderclap. Hugh's face drained of colour, and for the first time I saw fear flicker in his eyes. Poirot turned to me, his voice calm but deliberate. You see, Hastings, the act of a murderer is rarely as blunt as we imagine. It is about precision, about planning. And Hugh Denbury, monsieur, had been planning for months. I turned my gaze back to Hugh. His facade was cracking. His usual carefree attitude had vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his gaze now fixed intently on Hugh Denbury. Ah, monsieur, let us return to the beginning. The key to your plot lay not just in your brother's death, but in a marriage long ago. Hugh froze. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice suddenly shrill. Evelyn Harrogate, Poirot continued, had been married before. In a youthful indiscretion, she and her first love eloped. They believed it was annulled, but it was not. That was the skeleton in the closet, the one thing that could make Charles's marriage to Evelyn legally void. At this, Hugh's face twisted with genuine horror. How did you find out about that? Poirot gave a mild smile. Ah, that is not the question. The question, monsieur, is why you did not want your brother to know. A wedding, you see, is not only about love, it is also about legality. A marriage can be declared null and void if it turns out that the bride was already married, and if that were to happen, Evelyn would have had no right to inherit her share of the fortune. Hugh's lips parted, but no sound came out. Poirot's voice softened with gentle triumph. Your brother was the only thing standing between you and everything you wanted, monsieur, and you were willing to destroy him to get it. Poirot paused, allowing his words to settle over the room, then proceeded with the next piece of the puzzle. Ah, but there is more, Hugh, Poirot said. You did not simply wait for Charles to die of natural causes. Non, monsieur. You knew the wedding day was the perfect opportunity, a day when everyone would be focused on the bride and groom, on the celebration. You had to create a distraction. He turned to the vicar. The letter to you, monsieur, that cryptic warning, was not the work of some mysterious hand. It was written by none other than Hugh Denbury, using a clever ploy to distract you from the real events unfolding. Hugh's face turned ashen. You're insane. I didn't write that letter. Poirot raised a hand, cutting him off. Yes, you did. You needed to make sure the vicar was preoccupied. You wanted to ensure that the attention would be entirely on Evelyn. Poirot turned to the others, his eyes scanning the group with quiet satisfaction. And then you took the cyanide, Hugh, and planted it in the bride's bouquet. You staged the poisoning, so it would look as though Evelyn had been the one to administer it to Charles. The perfect crime, yes? Poirot's voice took on a mocking lilt. Hugh was now visibly trembling, but he still denied it, though less confidently. You're making all this up. I didn't. You did, Poirot said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. And you did it brilliantly, if I may say so. But the truth is, monsieur, your crime has unravelled, just as all clever schemes do. Poirot's smile was almost amused as he turned to the final clue. Ah, but there is yet another piece, my friends. You see, the key to the crime lay not in the bouquet nor in the letter, but in the pew where Evelyn stood. I frowned. The pew? What are you talking about, Poirot? Poirot glanced at me, his eyes sparkling with excitement. The indentation in the wood, Hastings. That small mark left behind where something had been hidden. I stared, remembering the small indentation Poirot had pointed out earlier. You mean something was hidden in the pew? Poirot nodded. Exactly. A A syringe, monsieur. A tiny syringe, disguised as a boutonniere pin. Hugh Denbury, you see, had already poisoned his brother by the time Charles took Evelyn's hand. I gasped, piecing the details together. So, Charles didn't die from the bouquet, it was the syringe. Non, Poirot confirmed. Hugh had placed the syringe, carefully concealed, in his brother's hand during the wedding ceremony. The poison was administered directly into Charles's palm, through a tiny prick in his skin. The rest, as they say, was just a performance. The room fell silent as the enormity of Poirot's deduction settled in. Hugh, unable to deny it any longer, looked down at his hands, his face pale with fear. The room had grown quiet, the air thick with tension. Poirot, standing before the gathered suspects, exuded an air of calm confidence, as though the pieces of the puzzle were already in place, waiting for the final revelation. Hugh Denbury sat in the chair, his earlier bravado now replaced with something far more unsettling. Fear. His eyes darted from Poirot to the others, but there was no escaping the trap that had been set. "Poirot," Hugh said, his voice shaky. "You know everything, don't you?" Poirot's smile was gentle, almost compassionate. "I know enough, monsieur. But you know everything." Hugh's face paled. He rubbed his forehead as if to clear his mind, but there was no escaping the truth. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could fix everything. Charles was a liability. He had everything I wanted and He faltered, unable to continue, the weight of his guilt pulling him deeper. "Go on, Hugh," Poirot said softly. "Tell us what you did." "I poisoned him," Hugh whispered, his voice barely audible. "I knew the wedding would be the perfect opportunity, a public setting where no one would suspect anything. I thought if I could just get rid of Charles, then everything would be mine. The money, the estate, everything." Poirot nodded, his expression never changing. "And you set it all up so perfectly, monsieur. The bouquet, the letter, the confusion, all of it designed to point the finger elsewhere." Hugh nodded miserably, his confession complete. "I'm sorry," he said, but there was no real remorse in his voice, only relief, the relief of a man who knew the game was over. As Hugh Denbury's confession hung in the air, Poirot turned to me, his expression thoughtful, though still serene. "You see, Hastings," Poirot began, his voice mild but carrying the weight of his reasoning. "A wedding is a ritual. It is predictable, almost to the point of being mechanical. The steps are laid out, the vows, the gestures, the promises, and in that predictability, one finds opportunity." I frowned. "I still don't see how that connects to the murder." Poirot smiled slightly. "Ah, but that is the brilliance, my friend. A wedding is a moment when everyone is watching the bride and groom, focused on the ceremony, on the symbols of love and union. The very predictability of the occasion makes it the perfect stage for a crime. The guests are all distracted, absorbed in the rituals, blind to the simple truth." He turned back to Hugh. "It was not just the act of killing, monsieur. It was how it was done. You took advantage of the fact that everyone expected this to be a joyful day, when in fact it was the perfect setting for a tragedy." I found myself nodding slowly, realizing how much the setting itself, the grandiosity of the ceremony, the ritualistic nature, had played a role. It was easy to see how someone like Hugh, with his coolness and calculating nature, could use such a moment to stage the perfect crime. "A simple thing," Poirot continued. "A seemingly innocent gesture becomes the perfect weapon. In the wedding, every action is expected. But in this case, one simple gesture, the handshake, was far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined." Poirot stood in front of the gathered suspects, his eyes sharp and knowing. He took a slow, deliberate step forward and glanced at me. "Hastings," he said, his voice low but filled with the weight of his knowledge, "do you know what makes a gesture powerful?" I blinked. "A gesture? You mean like a greeting?" "Precisely. A handshake. A smile, a touch. It is a small thing, yes? But it can carry so much more. It can be a signal, a moment of trust, or, in the case of a man like Hugh Denbury, it can be a lethal weapon. I looked at him, still unsure. What are you saying? Poirot's gaze turned towards Hugh. You, monsieur, had the perfect opportunity to carry out your crime when you took Evelyn's hand. The bride and groom standing before the guests, exchanging vows. Everyone was watching them, not you. He paused, letting his words sink in. You, monsieur, placed the poison in Charles's hand. You knew he would grasp Evelyn's hand, and as he did, the poison entered his body. A tiny prick of the needle, unnoticed, and within moments, the poison did its work. I was stunned. The handshake, it was the key. Mon ami, Poirot said with a smile. When you know the rituals so well, it becomes easy to manipulate them. Hugh Denbury, monsieur, had placed the syringe in his brother's hand, disguised as part of the boutonniere pin. It was simple, it was clever, and it was utterly invisible to anyone looking. I could almost hear the gasps of realization from the others in the room. What Poirot described was so subtle, so cleverly executed, that it seemed impossible to believe someone could pull it off in plain sight. And yet, Poirot added, his tone more reflective, it was the simplest gesture that betrayed him. The handshake, a symbol of union and goodwill, became the tool of betrayal and death. I stood, awed by Poirot's ability to connect all the threads so seamlessly, and for a moment, I wondered just how often we had been blind to such subtle details. As the last of the guests left Harrogate Manor, the atmosphere lightened. The tension that had hung in the air like a heavy fog began to dissipate. Poirot and I stood by the door, preparing to depart, but not before a final lesson from my ever-patient friend. Mon ami, Poirot said with a twinkle in his eye. You have learned something today, I hope. I groaned inwardly, already bracing myself for one of Poirot's familiar pointers. I suppose I have, but I must admit, I'm still a bit muddled about the headline of this case. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Ah, yes, the headline. You see, Hastings, you are always looking for the dramatic answer, the obvious conclusion. You were so sure that the bride, Evelyn, would be at the center of the crime. And yet, he paused for effect. It was never about her at all, was it? I scratched my head, still unsure. But the bride was involved, Poirot. The bouquet, the cyanide, the letter, all signs pointed to her. Ah, Poirot said. But you overlooked something important. The crime was not about a woman scorned. It was not about jealousy. It was about the motive to gain. Hugh Denbury had everything to gain by his brother's death, and yet you were so focused on the bride, the victim, that you missed the true killer standing right in front of you. I blinked. I thought I was looking at the right things. I didn't see Hugh until the very end. Poirot smiled gently. Ah, Hastings, that is why you are my valued companion. You observe, but you do not always see. I sighed, defeated. I suppose I'll never see things the way you do. Non, mon ami, Poirot said with a grin, but you will get closer every time. That is the true lesson, to question not just what you see, but also how you see it. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help but smile. Poirot was right. He had taught me more than I cared to admit. As we walked toward the door, ready to leave the tense, chaotic scene behind, Poirot suddenly stopped and turned back to me. Hastings, he said, his voice suddenly serious, there is one last detail you must know. What now? I asked, still digesting everything Poirot had revealed. The wedding, Poirot said softly. The whole thing, the ceremony, the vows, the ring, it was all for nothing. I looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Charles and Evelyn were married. Everyone saw it. Poirot's eyes sparkled. Ah, but Evelyn's first marriage was never properly annulled. The wedding was invalid, which means the crime, monsieur, was committed for nothing at all. The weight of his words hit me like a cold shower. So, you're saying that Hugh killed his brother for a fortune that Evelyn couldn't even claim? Exactement, mon ami, Poirot replied with a mournful smile. A crime committed not for love, not for wealth, but for nothing. How tragic, and yet how human. I stared at Poirot, speechless for a moment. The irony was almost unbearable. All that scheming, all that planning, and in the end, the entire thing had been built on a flawed foundation. Poirot's eyes softened. Sometimes, Hastings, the greatest crimes are committed not for what one stands to gain, but for what one believes they can never lose. I gave a quiet chuckle, the absurdity of it all sinking in, the tragic irony of it all. As Poirot and I stepped out of Harrowgate Manor into the cool evening air, I couldn't help but reflect on the lesson that had unfolded before us. You see, Hastings, Poirot said, with a quiet but profound smile, the truth, it always comes to light. In the end, it cannot be hidden, not forever. Even the most carefully woven web of deceit will unravel when the right mind, a mind that sees beyond the obvious, takes the time to observe the small details. I looked at Poirot, his words sinking in. It wasn't the dramatic gestures, the obvious clues that led us to the truth. It was the quiet, seemingly insignificant moments, the handshake, the hidden vial, the questions no one thought to ask, that revealed the murderer. Sometimes, mon ami, Poirot added with a touch of theatrical flair, the simple answers are the hardest to see, but they are always there, waiting for us to observe. I smiled, finally understanding the essence of his genius. It seems the real mystery, Poirot, was not the murder itself, but how you saw it all so clearly, when no one else could. Poirot laughed softly. Ah, Hastings, it is not my brilliance that solves the case. It is simply the art of observation, of seeing things as they are, not as we want them to be. With that, we turned toward the road, leaving behind the tragic, yet somehow illuminating story of the Denbury wedding. A crime born not of passion, but of the greed that so often lurks in the most unexpected places. But now, dear viewers, I ask you, what do you think was the biggest clue that led Poirot to solve the mystery? Was it the hidden syringe, the mysterious letter, or perhaps the subtle behavioral shifts in the suspects? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss what you think was the turning point in this case. If you enjoyed this Hercule Poirot mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more thrilling detective stories to life every day, and there's more to come, so stay tuned for the next gripping Poirot adventure. Until next time, keep observing the details, for that's where the truth always lies.